Jeff, well, welcome to Silver Creek Camp. Now, Uncle Jeff had brought Charlie and Red into the cabin. And he told them, boys, I want you to sit down. And they had a discussion about the key. And he said, you need to tell me the whole story. And they did. They went through the whole story about how they had seen Muscle Mike reach down in the grass between the register office and the dining hall and pick something up. And then they asked him, what did he find? And he wouldn't tell them. And then they began to think, I bet he found the key. Because it was in about the same place that Miss Eloise had been walking that day and had dropped it. So they had gone out that night to try to find it, to go up to Mike's cabin, Livingston Lodge, and to sneak in and get the key. Uncle Jeff had heard that story before and he couldn't believe it. He says, well, that may be what you want to tell me, but still we haven't answered the fact of how this key was found in your suitcase. Red spoke up and says, I bet Mike put it there. He said, I bet Mike's put it there because he's been jealous of Charlie the whole time. He didn't like Charlie's keys that he wears on his belt, and he just didn't like Charlie talking about God so much, and I think he tried to get him in trouble. And Red was just kind of shaking his head. Yep, that's what happened. Charlie kind of chimed in and said, it may be what happened. I know we have some problems, a little contention in the bathhouse and over on the athletic field. I don't know, but we think Mike did it. Uncle Jeff says, well, we know it was stolen during the time that you boys were out. Because in the registrar's office, there's a clock that's plugged into the wall. And last night, it became unplugged and knocked on the floor. And they looked at the time that was on the clock, and it said 11:05. You boys made it back to the cabin at 11:15. Charlie looked at Red. Red looked at Charlie. Charlie looked at Red. Red looked at Charlie. They looked at one another. What are we going to do? Now, Uncle Jeff said, you seem to have a story that I want to believe, but I can't believe it. Because you tell me, look at the evidence. You've got the key. You were out late last night. All fingers point to you guys. He says, but I think there's only one way for us probably to settle this. And let's go to the camp director and talk to him. The boys looked at one another. Oh, no, not the camp director. Not Mr. Lane, the camp director. Well, off they went down the trail. There's a big sign on this white building that said, Camp Director. Oh, my goodness. They'd never been in that office before. They walked in. Summer staff was there, secretary. She said, may I help you? He said, we've come to see the camp director. And the boys felt like they were prisoners. They walked around the big desks. They walked through the big door. They sat down on the sofa in front of the camp director, Mr. Lane's desk in his office. And he looked at them and said, boys, why are you here? Uncle Jeff said, sir, these are the boys I told you about and the key. He looked across the desk and he said, boys, y'all need to tell me what happened. Charlie spoke up and said, well, this is what happened. And he went through the whole story one more time. He says, well, it seems like you are accusing Mike of possibly stealing the keys and then stealing the money. But all the evidence points to you boys that y'all were out late and the key was found in your suitcase. I think the best thing for us to do is to get Mike in here and let's talk about it together. So they sent word for Mike to come. It didn't take him long because he was nearby in the game room. He came in, sat down after he glared at Charlie and Red, sat across from them in another chair, and Mr. Lane said, Mike, have you ever seen this key? Mike glanced up shortly, looked at Mr. Lane, looked at Charlie and Red, and said, I've never seen that key before in my life. He said, Mike, tell me why you were out late the other night, about the time that the money was taken from the registrar's office. He says, I was in bed I heard some noise outside my cabin. I went out to find out what it was, and I saw Red and Charlie running across the yard back toward their cabin from the registrar's office. And I bet they probably were there robbing the treasure chest and coming back to hide the money. Red just went off. He got ticked. He got mad. He stood up and started yelling, "You're a liar! You're lying!" Mr. Lane said, "Sit down." He went on to say, and I'll tell you what, this is Mike speaking. He said, all week they've been bragging about having a key. Charlie jumped up and said, "You're lying. You're a liar. That's not true." Mr. Lane said, "Sit down, young man." And he sat down. So Mr. Lane had to make a choice, a decision. He had two stories. He had evidence that pointed to Red and Charlie. And he said, "Boys, I'm going to give you one more chance. By 3 o'clock this afternoon, if one of you have not come to me and told me what's happened, the truth, tomorrow morning I'll be calling your parents and they'll come and pick up all 3 of you." Now you go on back to your next activity. Mike stood up, looked around, and kind of grinned and smirked at Red and Charlie and walked out. Red and Charlie got up and they kind of timidly, humbly kind of walked out the door knowing they were in a heap of trouble. When they got out to the steps and in the grass starting to walk back to their cabin, Red looked at Charlie and says, "What's going to happen? You think our parents, they're going to be so mad at us." Red said, "Don't worry about our parents. We know what's true. We know we didn't steal it. They'll believe us." Red said, "You know what? I feel just like Joseph." He says, Joseph was betrayed by his brothers. He was blamed for something he didn't do. But Charlie spoke up and said, "You know what? But God blessed him for being truthful. And we've told the truth." Well, the boys finished the days at camp activities and supper, and that night, as they did a couple times during the camp session, they were going to have a bonfire. All the campers loved the bonfire. And so they got with their cabin and all walked down toward the place near the lake on a little hill. And there in the distance, they saw a big mound of firewood that's already lit and crackling. Other campers were all gathered around it in a circle. And Mr. Lane, the camp director, got up and said, "Boys and girls, we're going to have a time of singing." So the worship leaders came up with their guitars and they started playing songs. They played "Lord, Please Make Me a Sanctuary." They played "We Are One in the Spirit." They played "Oh, Happy Day." And the boys and girls were really getting into the songs and enjoying them. And then Mr. Lane got up and said, "I'd like to give y'all an opportunity to come up and share. Maybe something about your week." So there's a boy over here. He got up. He walked up, and his name was Tom. And Tom said, "I just wanted to say that this week, the other night, when my counselor asked me, I asked Christ in my heart." And all the boys and girls just clapped. That was awesome. He was 8 years old, and for the first time, the Spirit of God really worked in his heart, and he expressed that by receiving Christ into his heart. Another young boy got up and talked about what he'd learned in the Bible studies from Mr. Hunt. One of the girls got up and shared that she had made new friends and how she looked forward to coming back next year. Charlie jumped up because, Charlie always likes to say something when he should and he shouldn't. Charlie got up and said, "I'd like to tell you about a verse that means a lot to me that I learned this week." And he talked about the verse. It says, "Love your enemies. Bless those that hate you. Do good to those that curse you. And pray for those that despitefully use you and persecute you." And he sat down. But right after he sat down, Uncle Jeff stood up. And Uncle Jeff began to say, Charlie, thank you for sharing that verse. And he began to talk about what that verse meant. And as he sat down, he glanced at Uncle Jeff, and Uncle Jeff seemed to kind of nod to him, like, Charlie, I believe what you've said about the key and the money. Mr. Lane said, boys and girls, we're going to sing one more song. And during this song, I want to give you a chance. If you have not in your life ever asked Christ in your heart, I want to give you that opportunity. So he went one more time through the story of why Christ came. That sin is in our hearts. We've all sinned. We all deserve death because of that sin. We're spiritually dead. But Christ, through his Son, who died on the cross, came so that we might have life. And he gives us an opportunity to receive Christ through faith, and he'll live in our heart and be with us the rest of our life. So he invited those that would like to pray that prayer to come up and stand beside him while they sang one more song. As they began to sing, 2 or 3 boys and a couple of girls came up and stood beside him. He spoke to them, and they stood quietly. And he says, I'll tell you, we're going to sing one more verse, and we'll be done. If anyone else would like to come up. But over on the corner, there was a little commotion. Just over there near the fire. And a young boy stood up. And this young boy was bigger than most of the other campers. And his hair was cut real short on the sides, kind of long in the middle. And it was Muscle Mike. And Muscle Mike, as you could see the fire and the light from the fire, you could see his face, and there were tears coming down his cheeks. And he walked over to Mr. Lane. And Mr. Lane put his arm on his shoulder. And Muscle Mike put his head on Mr. Lane's shoulder. And he spoke to him. The song finished. Mr. Lane had an opportunity to pray with the boys and girls as he come up. The other kids were looking at the fire and walking around. Charlie and Red started to head back to their cabin. And when they did, they got almost back, and then a hand grabbed Charlie on the shoulder. He turned around, and it was Mike. And he looked at Mike, and Mike said, Charlie, Red, I need to apologize to you. I lied about y'all. I didn't tell the truth. But I told Mr. Lane the whole story about the key and the money. And tonight, for the first time, I asked Christ into my heart. He said, Charlie, I've always been jealous of you from the first day. I watched you talk about Christ. I watched you be kind to me, even though we didn't get along. And I knew there was something different in your life. And I wanted to know what that was. So Charlie and Red looked at Mike, and they said, I'll tell you what have you got to do? Are you leaving tomorrow? He said, no, I won't be leaving. This is what I have to do. I have to wash dishes the rest of the week. And I not only have to wash dishes, I have to wear the apron of the cook. I not only have to wear the apron, but I've got to cut the potatoes. I've got to heat up the eggs and crack them all in the morning. I've got a lot of work ahead of me. And the last thing I've got to do, I've got to polish all the doorknobs and all the locks and all the keys around Silver Creek Camp. Charlie looked at him. He reached on his belt and undid the ring and handed it to Muscle Mike. And he said, I guess you could start right here. And that's the end of our story.